Chapter 63. Static in the Silence. Jimmy's eyes burned, the sting of sleepless nights and endless vigilance cutting through his skull like a dull blade. The air inside his post was damp, heavy with the smell of oil and rust. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, slung across his lap, staring out into the dark expanse beyond the homestead walls. Shadows danced at the edges of the forest, the faint rustle of wind in the trees making every muscle in his body coil with tension. Every hour crawled by, each second more grueling than the last. When his shift ended, Jimmy made his way back to his cabin, not to rest, but to listen. The ham radio sat on the splintered table, wires tangled like veins running to a beating heart. It was his lifeline, his obsession. Static crackled as he twisted the dial, his call sign repeating over and over into the void. The charge from the manual crank lasting only a few minutes. Whiskey, Bravo, 4-1. This is Papa Bear. Anyone reading? Whiskey, Bravo, 4-1. Copy. Nothing, just the hiss of dead air. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the cool edge of the desk, his breath fogging up the metal casing of the radio. Somewhere out there were the 8 lost preppers, the ones who had promised their aid when the world began to crumble. They were supposed to be a lifeline, a safety net. But now, with danger pressing closer to the homestead, their silence was a noose tightening around Jimmy's throat. He sat back, scrubbing a hand over his face, the rough stubble scratching his palm. Exhaustion gnawed at him, dragging him in and out of fitful moments of sleep, where dreams of the preppers, alive, dead or worse, shattered what little peace he might have found. Hours blurred together, but Jimmy never stopped scanning the airwaves. He repeated his calls, desperate to pierce through the static. His mind wandered, replaying fragments of conversations he'd had with the missing 8, their plans, their warnings, their promises. Whiskey Bravo 4-1. This is Papa Bear. 8 clicks south. Are you out there? He whispered again, his voice cracking with fatigue. Silence. Always silence. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, he stumbled back out to his post. The cold air bit at his face, and he gripped the rifle tighter, blinking hard to force his drooping eyelids to stay open. He scanned the tree line, every soul inside the homestead pressing down on him. He depended on him, on his vigilance, and on the promise that the missing preppers would come through. Days passed like this, an endless cycle of radio calls, fleeting moments of sleep, and hours at his post. His body moved like a machine, but his mind wavered, half asleep and half awake. The burden of the camp's survival clung to him, wrapping him in a suffocating haze. Every creak in the woods became a threat. Every flash of static on the radio felt like a lifeline, slipping further out of reach. And through it all, Jimmy held the line, desperate to believe that someone out there would answer his call. Chapter 64. Edge of Uncertainty. The next 3 days were grueling, both mentally and physically. The homesteaders stayed up all night, every night on pins and needles, waiting for an attack that might never come. The constant vigilance was exhausting, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind was enough to set their nerves on edge. Still, there was no sign of Jonas or his gang. No shadows in the trees, no movement along the horizon. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence of the nights and the uncertainty that hung over them like a cloud. Jimmy felt the weight of it all more than anyone else. He knew the importance of keeping everyone sharp, of making sure that nobody let their guard down. A single moment of carelessness could spell disaster for all of them. But after 3 days of waiting, with no sign of their enemy, it was becoming harder and harder to keep up the level of alertness they needed. People were tired, worn out from the lack of sleep, and stress of constantly watching for an enemy that might never come. Worse yet, some of the traps Mark had laid were only effective for a short period of time. The tripwires, the makeshift explosives, they were designed to be used soon after they were set. Any longer and they would become unreliable, or worse, dangerous to the homesteaders themselves. Everything they had prepared for had been for that first night. But Jonas and his gang had never come, and now 3 days later the tension was beginning to wear on everyone. It was almost 2 a.m. on the fourth night when Mark found himself sitting with his back against a tree, a cup of coffee in his hand. The night air was cool, the sky above him clear and filled with stars. He took a sip of the bitter liquid, the warmth of it spreading through him, keeping the chill at bay. He was no longer tired during the nights. His body had adjusted, shifting to a nocturnal schedule. He wondered if he would ever go back to normal, or if this was his life now, always waiting, always watching, always ready for a fight. His mind drifted back to the words Jimmy had said to him, words that had been repeated in his head for days now. As long as it takes. That was how long they would stay on high alert. That was how long they would be ready. As long as it took. Mark took another sip of his coffee, the warmth doing little to chase away the exhaustion of the past few days. He rubbed his tired eyes, and when he opened them again, he thought he saw movement down the road. He leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, trying to focus. There was nothing there. Still, something felt off. The uneasy sensation crept over him, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. His instincts whispered that something was out there, lurking just beyond his sight. Mark set his coffee cup down, his hand reaching for his rifle. He took a prone position, lying flat against the ground, the cold earth beneath him. He raised the rifle, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Nothing but darkness and shadows. He let out a sigh of relief, lowering the rifle. Maybe it was just his imagination, just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But then, just as he was about to relax, he saw it, a figure darting between the trees. Mark's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes strained to see. There it was again, a man moving quickly, trying to stay out of sight. And then another, and another. His heart sank, a wave of dread washing over him. The attack was coming, and it was coming tonight. Chapter 65. Brace for Impact. Mark reached for the alarm bell, his heart pounding. But before he could ring it, he heard another bell go off, then another, and another. His worst fear confirmed. The enemy was coming from all directions. The bells echoed throughout the homestead, the sound piercing the quiet night, sending a wave of panic through the camp. Mark adjusted his grip on his rifle, trying to keep his hands steady. He raised it, peering into the darkness. Beside him stood two preppers, Sam and Ethan, their faces pale. Both were barely in their 20s, yet hardened by the life they had chosen. "Hold your fire until I shoot first," Mark ordered, his voice low. "Understood," Sam replied, his hands gripping his rifle tightly. Ethan nodded, his eyes focused on the tree line ahead of them. "We're with you, Mark," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Mark nodded, his eyes returning to his target. "Stay sharp and don't waste ammo," he said. "We need to hold them off here. If they break through, we move positions to help out. We don't know where the heavy flank is going yet." The alarm bells echoed through the homestead, blending with the distant shouts of other homesteaders as they moved into position. Mark's hands trembled, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He clenched his jaw, focusing on calming himself, steadying his aim. "Slow down," Mark muttered to himself. "One shot at a time. One shot at a time." He took a few deep breaths, in and out, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing. He could feel his heart rate begin to slow, the adrenaline giving way to a cold, focused determination. He took one last, large breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Suddenly he saw movement, an armed man poking his head out from behind a tree, trying to get a look at their position. Mark steadied the rifle, his breath held in his chest. He squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as the shot rang out. The man went down, his body crumpling to the ground. For a moment there was silence, the world around Mark seeming to freeze. And then all at once, the night erupted into chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the sound of feet pounding against the ground as the enemy advanced. "Here they come!" Mark shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. "Hold your ground! Don't let them break through!" Sam and Ethan nodded, their eyes wide. They raised their rifles, their bodies tense as they waited for the enemy to come into view. Mark took another deep breath, his eyes scanning the tree line. The enemy was coming, and they were coming fast. Chapter 66. Chaos Under the Stars. A chorus of gunfire rang out, the sharp cracks echoing through the night as the battle began in earnest. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He barked orders to the two preppers below him, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I see 3, 12 o'clock behind the tree line," Mark shouted, his eyes glued to the targets. Sam and Ethan nodded, raising their rifles and taking aim. A few shots rang out, the bullets slicing through the night air. Mark steadied himself, taking another shot, but missed. He muttered to himself. "Come on, steady, you can do this," Mark muttered, his voice firm as he fought to calm the adrenaline surging through his veins. The sounds of battle filled the air. The shouts of the attackers, the cracks of gunfire, the thud of bullets hitting the ground. Mark's adrenaline surged, his senses heightened. He spotted another man, trying to run across an opening to get closer to their position. Mark took aim, his fingers squeezing the trigger, and watched as the man fell to the ground. "Got another one," Mark called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Keep the pressure up! Don't let them get closer!" The air around him seemed to explode. The sharp cracks of bullets whizzed past his position, the sound deafening in his ears. Mark ducked down, his body pressed against the cold earth. It took a second to compose himself, the reality of the situation hitting him hard. This was real. This was happening. He could die tonight. His thoughts flickered to Sarah and Hope, their faces flashing before his eyes. He couldn't let anything happen to him. He couldn't let them be alone. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now. Mark raised his rifle again, focusing on the tree line. He spotted another figure moving cautiously, attempting to stay hidden. Mark controlled his breath, his finger pressing the trigger. The shot rang out and the man dropped instantly. Without hesitation, Mark shifted his aim, scanning for the next target. His mind drifted for just a split second to the gas station, the first time he had taken a life. The guilt had consumed him for days, the weight of what he had done almost too much to bear. But now, there was no guilt, no hesitation. Only one thing mattered: survival. He took another deep breath, his eyes focused, his body tense. The world around him seemed to fade away, the sounds of the battle growing distant. All that mattered was the rifle in his hands, the enemy in his sights, and the will to protect his home and his family. Mark fired again, the recoil of the rifle jolting through his body. Another enemy down. He adjusted his aim, his eyes locking onto the next target. The battle raged on, the night filled with the sounds of gunfire and the shouts of men, and through it all, Mark stood his ground, his mind focused, his heart unyielding. Mark stayed focused, his eyes never leaving the tree line in front of him. The two preppers with him, Sam and Ethan, were doing their best to keep the threat at bay. They fired in short, controlled bursts, their faces set in grim determination. None of them knew how many attackers there were, and that uncertainty gnawed at Mark. He counted maybe 6 or 7 in the forest in front of him, but it was impossible to be sure. The enemy fired back, but with the height advantage of their position, they couldn't advance without being picked off. Mark hoped that was it, that Jonas had overstated the size of his force. Maybe these attackers were used to picking off unarmed people, those without defenses. Maybe they hadn't expected the kind of resistance they were facing tonight. Mark unloaded an entire magazine into the woods, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as he fired. He wasn't aiming for any one particular target, just trying to get them to fall back, to make them think twice about advancing. The sharp cracks of his rifle echoed through the night, mixing with the shouts and gunfire coming from the other parts of the homestead. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. He saw movement in the trees, the attackers hesitating, starting to pull back. A glimmer of hope flickered in Mark's chest. Maybe they were turning back. Maybe they were giving up. But then he saw it. Movement to the east, the attackers shifting, moving towards the east entrance. Mark's heart sank. They were redirecting, trying to find a weaker spot to break through. Mark took a second, his mind racing. He turned to Sam and Ethan, his voice urgent. "You two stay here, keep holding them off. I'm moving to help the others at the east entrance." Sam's eyes widened, but he nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Got it, Mark. Be careful." Ethan gave a quick nod, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "We'll hold him there. Go." Mark hesitated for just a second, his eyes flickering between the two young men. He knew he was leaving them in a dangerous position, but he had no choice. The east entrance was vulnerable, and if the attackers broke through there, the entire homestead would be in danger. "Hold your ground," Mark said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." With that, he turned and slid down from his post, his feet hitting the ground with a dull thud. His heart pounded in his chest as he steadied himself. Then he ran. He ran as fast as he could, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes locked on the direction of the heaviest gunfire. Chapter 67. Into the Heart of Danger. Mark continued to run, his legs pounding as he covered the 100 yards or so from his position to the front, where the heaviest fire was coming from. His worst fears started to materialize in his mind. The group that had attacked his quadrant had only been a scout team, soldiers sent to probe for weaknesses. The real attack was happening at the front, and it was brutal. Jonas wasn't messing around. He was either reckless or had so many men that it didn't matter which direction he attacked from. He was going to try to take the homestead by sheer force. Judging by the amount of gunfire, it was the latter. Mark pushed himself harder, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. As he sprinted, he took a quick look at the barn in the middle of the homestead, the fallback position. Hope and Sarah were both in there, along with one other prepper, keeping watch. Things got worse. That barn was where everyone would retreat to, for a last stand. It was fortified, stocked with supplies, and had been prepared for this very situation. The thought of his wife and daughter being in there filled him with both determination and dread. He wanted to see them just for a moment. If this was it, if this was their last stand, he wanted to see their faces one more time. He wanted to go to the barn, to hold them, to tell them everything would be all right, even if he wasn't sure himself. But he couldn't. The homestead needed him. Jimmy and Dozer needed him. The people defending the front needed every hand they could get. Mark clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push on. He ran through the darkness, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his eyes fixed ahead on the flashes of gunfire and the sounds of battle. The closer he got, the louder the chaos became. the shouts of the attackers, the crack of gunfire. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the air. Mark's legs burned. His body screamed for rest, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't slow down, not now. As he rounded the final corner, the front entrance of the homestead came into view. The scene was pure chaos. The attackers were pushing hard, their figures barely visible in the darkness as they moved between the trees, firing towards the barricades. When Mark reached the front, it was clear that Jimmy had moved most of the preppers into this position. The defenders were scattered behind the makeshift barricades, their faces white as they fired into the darkness. They were doing their best to keep the enemy at bay, but it was a struggle. One that Mark could see was not going in their favor. Mark took cover behind the front gate, the heavy wooden structure that had been reinforced with metal sheets and barbed wire. He couldn't see much of the battlefield from his position, but the intensity of the gunfire told him enough. The attackers were pushing hard, trying to break through the defenses. He scanned the area, looking for Jimmy, and spotted him jumping down from an elevated post, his rifle slung across his back. Mark sprinted over, ducking low, as bullets whizzed past him, the ground erupting in small plumes of dirt. He reached Jimmy, the two men locking eyes, and Mark could see the exhaustion etched on his brother's face. "How bad is it?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Jimmy's eyes swept over the area, his expression grim. "They have a lot," he said, his voice low. "A lot more than we expected, but we're holding for now. Some of them hit your traps, which slowed them down, but it won't be long before they push through." Mark shook his head, his heart sinking. "We can't fall back yet. It's too soon. If we pull back now, we'll lose the front." Jimmy nodded, his face set in a hard line. "I know, but listen, they can't go around. Your traps will get them. If they try to climb over the front gate, they'll be exposed. We can pick them off, but we need to keep them back for now. We need to buy ourselves more time." Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew Jimmy was right. The front gate was their best chance to hold the attackers back, but it wouldn't last forever. They had to make every movement count. "Get up on the post," Jimmy said, nodding toward the elevated position he had just vacated. "We need you up there. We need every shot we can get." Mark nodded, clapping Jimmy on the shoulder, before turning and making his way to the post. He climbed up, the wooden structure creaking under his weight, his rifle slung across his back. He kept his head low, moving in a prone position as he reached the top, taking cover behind the wooden planks. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, and a bullet snapped into the tree next to him, sending splinters flying. Mark ducked lower, his heart pounding, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He took a moment to steady himself before crawling forward, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The night sky was black, not even a sliver of moonlight to illuminate the chaos below. In the distance, he could see the flashes of muzzle fire, bright bursts of light that pierced the darkness. There were a lot of them, more than he had anticipated. The enemy was well equipped, their numbers overwhelming. Tracer rounds streaked through the sky, their red glow cutting through the darkness, and Mark realized just how badly outnumbered they were. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was a battlefield, and the enemy had more soldiers than he could have imagined, but there was no time to dwell on that now. They had to hold. They had to fight. Mark raised his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he focused on his target. The silhouettes of the attackers moved in the darkness, probing for a way through the defenses. His grip tightened, his finger brushing the trigger. He fired, the rifle kicking against his shoulder, the shot ringing out into the night. Chapter 68. Facing the Abyss. Dozer's voice boomed through the chaos, his commands cutting through the deafening gunfire. "Keep firing! If they move, don't let them flank us or gain ground!" Mark steadied his rifle, trying to keep his aim focused. But he had to drop his head as a spray of bullets whizzed by, the air hissing with deadly intent. He cursed under his breath. Motherfuckers, there's a lot of them. Dozer, still shouting, turned to the others. Keep firing! Don't let up! They're going to try to suppress us and then move up. We can't let that happen. The preppers obeyed, their guns cracking through the darkness as they fired into the unknown. It was too dark to see anything clearly, and the attackers seemed to be everywhere at once. The only thing to aim at were the flashes of muzzle fire in the distance. But it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and they had the numbers. An explosion rocked the front gate, the force of it shaking the ground beneath them. Mark felt the impact reverberate through his bones, and he stumbled, his ears ringing from the blast. Watch for grenades, Dozer shouted, his voice urgent. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief, a cold dread settling in his gut. They have grenades? What the hell is going on? The situation was spiraling out of control, going from bad to worse with each passing moment. The attackers were well-equipped, better than any of them had anticipated. Dozer and the preppers kept firing, trying desperately to hold their positions, but it was clear that they were outmatched. Mark counted at least 30 of them in the distance, their silhouettes just visible as they moved between the trees. They had the numbers, and this wasn't looking good. All of a sudden, a panicked cry broke through the noise. I'm hit! I'm hit! Mark spun around, his eyes scanning the area. He saw one of the preppers, Ethan, on the ground, clutching his stomach, his face twisted in pain. In that moment, Mark realized that they could all die here. This wasn't just about holding the line. It was about making it through the night, and the chances of survival felt slimmer by the second. Mark stood frozen, his eyes locked on Ethan, the prepper who had been shot. The wound in Ethan's stomach was gaping, blood pouring out, staining the dirt beneath him. The dark red spread rapidly, and Mark knew without intervention Ethan would bleed out in the next few minutes. Time seemed to slow, and Mark felt the moment press down on him. His thoughts drifted, spiraling into the fear that this was how it would end for all of them. Was this going to happen to him? To Sarah? To Hope? Suddenly, a loud scream from Dozer brought Mark back to the present, snapping him out of his frozen state. They're coming! Hold them back! Dozer's voice was desperate, urgent. Mark swung around, raising his rifle and firing again. His hands were shaking, but he managed to steady himself enough to aim at the approaching figures. He could see them now, their silhouettes moving up to the edge of the tree line. They were getting close. Too close. They were within 20 yards of the homestead, and their gunfire was different this time. It wasn't random. It wasn't blind. They could see their targets. The bullets whizzed past him, closer and closer, each one a reminder of just how precarious their position had become. Dozer's voice cut through the chaos again, this time more panicked. We need to fall back! We need to fall back! The front is lost! Mark looked around, his eyes darting from one prepper to the next. They were all waiting for Jimmy's order. This wasn't part of the plan. Losing the front this fast was something none of them had prepared for. The confusion and fear were thick, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the word that would decide their next move. Finally, Jimmy's voice rose above the din, shouting the words no one wanted to hear. Fall back! Fall back to the second position! The panic in his voice was evident, but it was the only option they had left. The front was overrun. They had to retreat if they had any hope of surviving the night. Mark climbed down from the elevated post, his legs shaky beneath him. He hit the ground running, his mind racing with the urgency of what needed to be done. He saw Jimmy, his face pale, motioning toward the fallback position. Get the traps ready, Jimmy yelled as he approached Mark, his eyes wide with desperation. Get the traps ready now. Mark nodded. He turned and sprinted toward the fallback area, the place they had designated as their next line of defense. He could hear the shouts of the other preppers, the chaos of the retreat, the sound of gunfire still echoing through the night. The attackers were relentless, and Mark knew they wouldn't have much time before they were at the second position. The fallback area was a maze of hastily constructed barriers, trenches, and makeshift fortifications. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. Mark reached the first set of traps, a series of wire-triggered explosives meant to slow the attackers down and give them some breathing room. He dropped to his knees, his hands moving quickly, setting the charges, his fingers fumbling as the fear threatened to overwhelm him. The second bunker was their last hope, a makeshift fortress hastily constructed out of reinforced wood and metal sheets. Mark crouched behind the barricades, the traps, ready to be activated at a moment's notice. His hands were shaky, but he knew he had to stay focused. The attackers were relentless, and if they pushed past this line, there would be nowhere else for them to go. Jimmy stood beside him, his rifle propped against the barricade, as he watched the darkness. Mark could hear the distant gunfire and the shouts of the attackers growing closer with every moment. The second bunker was their fallback position, but it offered little security. His eyes shifted to the trap, a makeshift explosive that required manual activation. He had rigged it to cover the main door in case the attackers breached the bunker. There was movement. Mark saw the first figure come over the barricade, the attacker's silhouette visible in the darkness. A shot rang out, and the figure fell, falling back over the barricade. More attackers followed, climbing over the barricade, their figures shrouded in shadow. "They're coming!" Jimmy shouted, his voice filled with panic. He raised his rifle, firing at the approaching attackers. "Hold them back!" Mark watched as more figures climbed over the door, their shapes moving quickly, trying to find a way in. Jimmy turned to him, his eyes wide with desperation. "Mark, now, the traps!" Mark didn't hesitate. He reached down, his hands finding the trigger for the explosive. He pulled it, his eyes locked on the attackers. The explosion was deafening, a bright flash of light that illuminated the entire area. The attackers were thrown back, their bodies crumpling to the ground, the force of the explosion tearing through them. But there was no time to celebrate. The attackers kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Mark heard a loud explosion from the front gate, the sound reverberating through the bunker. His heart sank as he realized what had happened. The front gate was destroyed. "Hold them back!" Jimmy shouted. "Don't let them take position!" Mark raised his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he aimed at the attackers. He fired, the recoil jolting through his body. The gunfire erupted around him, the flashes of light illuminating the attackers as they pushed forward. He could see them now, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. He fired again, his finger tight on the trigger, the shots ringing out in quick succession. He could feel the exhaustion in his muscles, the weight of the rifle, heavy in his hands. He reached into his satchel, grabbing more magazines, his hands moving fast as he reloaded. He couldn't afford to slow down, not now. Mark took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto the next target. He fired, the shot finding its mark, the attacker falling to the ground. But there were too many of them. They were pushing forward, their numbers overwhelming. Mark could see them moving through the bunker, their figures taking cover, finding positions inside the homestead. Dozer's voice rang out, his deep voice filled with urgency. "If we can't hold them, we need to fall back again." Jimmy shook his head, his face set in a mask of determination. "I'm not falling back. We hold this now." Chapter 69. Stand your ground. The attack continued, the relentless barrage of gunfire echoing through the bunker. Mark stayed crouched behind the barricade. He could hear the shouts of the attackers, the sharp cracks of their rifles as they fired into the darkness. Next to him was a young prepper named Alex, his face pale but resolute, his rifle resting on the barricade in front of him. Alex turned to Mark. I'm running out of ammo. Do you have another clip? Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the area for a moment before answering. Yeah, hold on a second. He raised his rifle, providing cover fire as Alex moved closer, his hands trembling as he took cover beside Mark. They both stayed low, the bullets whizzing by, each one a reminder of how close they were to death. The noise was deafening, the flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the darkness. Mark reached into his satchel, pulling out a magazine and handing it to Alex. Here, take it, Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Alex took the magazine, his hands shaking as he reloaded his rifle. Mark took a moment, closing his eyes for just a second, trying to steady his breathing, trying to compose himself. He knew they had to keep fighting, that there was no other option. He had to keep going for Sarah, for Hope, for everyone in the homestead. Suddenly there was movement beside him. Alex stood up, his rifle raised as he took aim at the attackers. Before Mark could react, a loud crack echoed through the night, and Alex's head exploded, the bullet hitting him directly in the skull. Blood and bone sprayed across the barricade, splattering onto Mark's face. Mark let out a gasp, his eyes wide with shock as Alex's body fell beside him, collapsing to the ground. He could feel the warmth of the blood on his face, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The noise of the battle faded, and all Mark could see was Alex, his lifeless body lying next to him, a bullet hole in his head. Mark's hands trembled, his breath hitching in his throat. How close he was to death hit him like a punch to the gut. This could be it. This could be how it ended. A single bullet, and it would be all over. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as he fought to push the fear aside. He had to stay focused. He had to keep fighting. He let out a silent prayer, his lips moving without sound. He prayed that he wouldn't meet the same fate as Alex, that he would make it through this, that he would see Sarah and Hope again. He had to believe that. He had to believe that there was still hope. Mark turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the barricade. The attackers were still coming, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. He couldn't let fear take over, not now. He had to fight. He had to protect the homestead, protect his family, protect everyone who counted on him. Mark stood up, his rifle in his hands, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired, the shots ringing out in quick succession, the recoil jolting through his body. He aimed at the figures moving toward them, his eyes focused, his mind clear. He couldn't let them get through. He had to hold the line. The gunfire was deafening, the flashes of light blinding in the darkness. Mark could see the attackers, their silhouettes moving closer, their gunfire growing more intense. He fired again, each shot deliberate, each shot aimed to protect the people behind him. Chapter 70. Falling back to safety. The battle raged on, the preppers holding their ground, their rifles blazing into the darkness as they fought desperately to keep the attackers at bay. The noise was deafening, flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the chaotic scene. Mark crouched low behind the barricade, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Jimmy dropped down beside him, his face grim. "We can only hold this position for a bit longer," he said. Mark's heart sank at the words. They were the last thing he wanted to hear. "We can't fall back to the barn," he said, shaking his head. "Hope and Sarah are there." Jimmy's face was set, his eyes scanning the area. "There are too many of them, Mark. Can't risk getting flanked. If they surround us here, we're done." He popped off, firing off a few shots, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. "Please, Jimmy," Mark pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. "We can hold this longer. We have to." Jimmy shook his head, his expression pained. "I wouldn't do this unless it was necessary, Mark. I promise you that. But if we stay here any longer, they will kill us. All of us. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the barn in the distance. He could see it through the darkness, the faint outline barely visible. His thoughts went to Sarah and Hope, their faces flashing before his eyes. He had to protect them no matter what. Jimmy placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. Listen to me. Me, Dozer, and the others will provide cover fire. You need to get to the second floor of the barn. You'll have the elevation and you can cover us as we fall back. We'll make the barn our Alamo, but we have to move now. Mark nodded, the pressure of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He didn't want to leave, didn't want to fall back, but he knew Jimmy was right. They couldn't hold this position any longer. They had to make a stand at the barn. You understand? Jimmy asked. His eyes locked on Mark's. Mark nodded. I understand. Jimmy gave him a quick nod, then turned to Dozer, who was a few feet away, firing into the darkness. Get ready! Jimmy shouted, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. He looked at Dozer, his face set with determination. Now! Dozer nodded, his deep voice booming as he called out to the others. Covering fire! The preppers opened up, their rifles firing in unison, the flashes of light illuminating their faces, the gunfire echoing through the night. He turned, signaling to the two other preppers beside him. Let's go. Without another word, Mark pushed himself up, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the barn, the two preppers following close behind. The ground was uneven, the dirt and debris making every step treacherous. Mark could hear the gunfire behind him, the shouts of the attackers as they continued their relentless assault. He pushed on, his eyes locked on the barn, his only thought to reach it, to get to safety. The barn loomed ahead, its dark silhouette to beacon in the chaos. Mark could see the door, slightly open, the faint light from inside spilling out onto the ground. He reached it, throwing the door open and ushering the others inside. Get to the second floor! Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. The two preppers didn't hesitate, rushing towards the ladder that led to the upper level. Mark followed as he climbed, his hands gripping the rungs. He reached the top, pulling himself up and turning to look out over the battlefield. Chapter 71. The Alamo. Mark rushed into the barn, the adrenaline rushing through his veins. As soon as he stepped inside, he froze for a moment. In the corner, huddled together, were Sarah and Hope. Sarah had her arms wrapped around Hope, who was crying hysterically, her small body trembling with fear. Sarah rocked her gently, whispering, It will be all right, it'll be all right, her voice shaky. Sarah's eyes looked up, meeting Mark's. There was a mixture of relief and fear in her gaze, and Mark felt his heart ache at the sight of them. He rushed over, dropping to his knees beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them. He held them close, feeling the warmth of their bodies, the fear in their trembling. He knew he needed to get upstairs, needed to provide covering fire for the others. But after seeing how Alex had died, how close he had come to death himself, he needed one last embrace. They said nothing to each other. There were no words that could capture what they were feeling at that moment. The cracks of gunfire echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Mark closed his eyes, his forehead resting against Sarah's. I love you both so much, he whispered, his voice breaking. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. He pulled back, looking at them, his eyes filled with determination. Go up to the second floor, he said, his voice firm. There's a supply closet up there. Barricade yourselves in. Stay quiet. Stay safe. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. And what about you? She asked. Mark cupped her face in his hands, his eyes locked on hers. I'm going to protect this homestead, he said, his voice steady. Go now, go. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She grabbed Hope's hand, pulling her to her feet. They ran towards the ladder that led to the second floor, their footsteps echoing in the empty barn. Mark watched them for a moment, his heart heavy, before turning back towards the side window. He moved to the window, bracing his rifle on the ledge. From this position, he had a clear view of the attackers. He steadied his hands and took aim. For a brief moment, a strange calm settled over him. The gunfire outside felt distant, the world narrowing to the sight through his rifle. Mark squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking against his shoulder. He saw the man go down, his body dropping to the ground. He adjusted his aim, fired again, dropping another attacker. He fired a third shot, hitting his target square in the chest. But before he could empty the clip, the attackers fired back. Bullets whizzed past, slamming into the side of the barn. The sound of splintering wood filled the air. Mark ducked down, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't stay here. The window was too exposed. He turned, heading towards the ladder that led to the second floor. He climbed up, his hands gripping the rungs, his body moving on instinct. He had to get to higher ground. He had to protect Sarah and Hope. He had to protect everyone. When he reached the second floor, he moved to one of the windows and dropped into a prone position, his rifle steady on the ledge. From here, he had the advantage, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He scanned the tree line, his eyes sharp, searching for any sign of movement. The attackers were still coming, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. Mark aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired, the shot ringing out, the recoil jolting through his body. One of the attackers went down, his body collapsing to the ground. Mark adjusted his aim, his eyes locking onto the next target. He fired again, each shot deliberate, each shot aimed to protect the people he loved. He could see the flashes of muzzle fire in the distance, the bright bursts of light illuminating the attackers as they pushed forward. He fired again, his focus pure, his determination unwavering. Chapter 72. Defending what matters most. Mark steadied his rifle as he looked out over the battlefield. The front gate, the barrier that had once protected the homestead, was now nothing more than a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. The enemy soldiers were moving forward, taking up positions within the homestead. They were swarming like ants, their dark figures hardly visible in the faint moonlight. Mark exhaled slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired, the shot ringing out, the recoil jolting through his body. He fired again, each shot deliberate, each one aimed to protect the people behind him. Below, he could see Jimmy and the others, still holding their ground, their rifles firing into the advancing attackers. "Come on, Jimmy," Mark muttered under his breath. His eyes locked on his brother. "Get them out of there! Get them out of there!" Mark continued to provide covering fire, his eyes never leaving the advancing enemy. They were getting closer to Jimmy and the remaining preppers, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. Mark's heart raced, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He could see them getting closer, inching their way towards Jimmy's position. "Come on, Jimmy," Mark said, his voice filled with desperation. "What are you doing?" A massive explosion erupted, the ground shaking beneath him. One of Mark's traps had gone off, the bright flash of light illuminating the night. He watched as the explosion tore through the attackers, their bodies thrown back, the force of the blast ripping through them. It was a small victory, but it gave them a moment, a brief pause in the relentless assault. Using the explosion as a distraction, Jimmy gave the order, "Fall back! Fall back now!" He aimed, his eyes locked onto the attackers as they recovered from the blast. He fired, providing covering fire, as Jimmy and the others began to fall back towards the barn. Mark could see them moving, their figures darting through the darkness. "Come on," Mark muttered, his eyes following Jimmy. He fired again, his shots deliberate, each one meant to protect his friends. He could see the attackers regrouping, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. He had to give Jimmy and the others time. He had to hold them back. Suddenly, another explosion erupted, the bright flash of light illuminating the entire battlefield. Mark watched as another one of his traps went off, the blast tearing through the attackers, their bodies dropping to the ground. The explosion lit up the night, the bright light casting long shadows across the homestead. In that moment, Mark could see them all, the enemy soldiers, their figures illuminated by the explosion. There were so many of them, more than he had realized. They were everywhere, their dark silhouettes moving through the homestead, their weapons raised, their movements coordinated. Mark's heart sank, a cold dread settling in his stomach. There were too many of them. They didn't stand a chance. He could see it now, the reality of the situation hitting him like a punch to the stomach. It was only a matter of time before the homestead was overrun. The preppers came rushing into the barn, their faces pale, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the barn. Jimmy moved fast, securing the locks, his hands trembling as he did so. "Lock everything up! Full lockdown!" Jimmy shouted, his voice carrying through the large space. "Everyone get to a window! Take a position!" Mark watched as the others moved, their faces set with grim courage. He knew this was bad. This was the Alamo. They had fallen back as far as they could. There was nowhere else to go. This was their last stand. Mark made his way down from his perch, his legs shaky beneath him. He saw Jimmy near the doors, his face pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with fear. Mark didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that glance, they both understood the weight of the situation. "Open Sarah or locked away," Mark said. Jimmy nodded, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like regret. His gaze shifted to the rest of the preppers taking their positions. "We hold our ground here," Jimmy said, his voice rising to carry through the barn. "We hold them off. We don't let them get through. This is our home. We fight for it." Everyone moved quickly, finding a window or taking cover behind a sandbag. They knew what they had to do. They had prepared for this moment, trained for it. But now that it was here, the fear was thick. Mark could see it in their eyes, the way their hands shook as they loaded their rifles, the way they glanced at each other, their expressions of fear. Jimmy barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't let them gain an inch. We hold them here." Mark turned, making his way back up to the second level. He climbed the ladder, his hands gripping the rungs. He reached his perch, dropping to a prone position, his rifle resting on the ledge. From here, he had a good view of the front of the homestead, the attackers moving through the darkness. He exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he lined up his shot, his finger tightening on the trigger. As he fired, the shot echoed, the recoil jarring through his body. He watched as the man went down, collapsing to the ground. Without hesitation, he adjusted his aim, fired again, and another attacker fell. But they kept coming. There were too many of them. Mark could see them moving through the darkness, their figures barely visible in the faint moonlight. They were relentless, their movements coordinated. They were going to be overrun. It was only a matter of time. Mark took a deep breath, his hands steadying on his rifle. He fired again. He could hear the others below, their rifles firing in unison, the sound echoing through the barn. The attackers were getting closer, their gunfire growing more intense, the bullets slamming into the side of the barn, splintering the wood. He thought of Sarah and Hope, huddled together in the supply closet, their faces filled with fear. He couldn't let anything happen to them. He had to protect them. He had to keep them safe. He fired again, his shots finding their mark, each one a small victory in the midst of the chaos. The attackers were getting closer, their figures moving through the darkness, their weapons raised. Chapter 73. A Needed Spark. The chaos intensified, the sound of gunfire deafening as more enemy troops kept pouring in from every direction. The preppers in the barn could barely return fire. The attackers' relentless barrage was overwhelming. Bullets slammed into the sides of the barn, and Mark could hear the panicked shouts of the preppers around him. "We're gonna die," one of them screamed, his voice filled with fear. Mark looked over at Jimmy, who was crouched near one of the windows, his face pale. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was a look of regret on Jimmy's face. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry." Mark felt his heart sink, his stomach churning with fear. This was it. This was the end. There was no way out. He looked down at his rifle, his hands trembling as he fired off the remaining bullets in his magazine. The shots rang out, but he knew it wasn't enough. There were too many of them. He fumbled to reload, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He thought of Sarah and Hope. He had to protect them down to the very end. He had to keep fighting even if it meant his life. He heard the preppers around him, their voices filled with panic. "There's too many of them," someone shouted. They keep coming! They keep coming! We're gonna die! This is it!" Mark closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he let out a soft prayer. "Please," he whispered, his voice hardly audible over the chaos. "Let the end be quick." He could hear the enemy moving below, their gunfire drawing closer to the barn. It would only be minutes before they reached the second floor, before they took them out one by one. Mark exhaled slowly, bracing himself for what was to come. There was a burst of light, so bright that it pierced through the darkness even with his eyes closed. Mark's eyes shot open, his heart pounding in his chest. A large explosion erupted in the middle of the homestead, the ground shaking beneath them. An eruption of gunfire followed, but it wasn't coming towards the barn. It was aimed at the enemy. Mark turned, his eyes wide with shock as he looked out the window. He could see the enemy's soldiers below, their attention diverted as they were fired upon from the front entrance. Someone else was attacking them. "What the fuck is going on?" Mark muttered, his eyes scanning the chaos below. Jimmy moved beside him, his eyes wide as he looked at the window. "It's the rest of them," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The missing preppers. They're here." For a moment, they were both stunned, unable to comprehend the miracle that had just happened. The enemy, who had seemed unstoppable just moments before, was now under attack from a new force. Mark watched as the remaining preppers came charging through the front gate, their weapons blazing. The enemy was caught off guard, their focus now on the large wave of preppers advancing from the entrance. Jimmy let out a shaky breath, his eyes wide with hope. "They brought reinforcements," he said, his voice filled with awe. "There's a ton of them." Mark could see it now. The tides of battle were turning. The enemy, once so sure of their victory, was now in disarray, their formation broken. They were being flanked, caught between the preppers in the barn and the reinforcements coming through the gate. "Fire!" Jimmy shouted, his voice filled with renewed determination. "We need to get them! Get all of them now!" Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing as he took aim. He fired, a shot ringing out. The enemy soldiers were caught in the open with no cover to protect them. They were stuck, trapped between two forces bearing down on them, with nowhere to go. The preppers in the barn opened fire, their rifles blazing as they joined in the attack. Mark could see the enemy soldiers dropping, their bodies falling to the ground one by one. The once overwhelming force was now being cut down, their numbers dwindling with each passing second. Mark fired again. He could feel the tide turning. The hope that had seemed lost just moments before, now burning bright within him. They had a chance. They could win this. Chapter 74. The Turning Tides. Jimmy could feel it. The tide had turned. They had the upper hand now, and they couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. He turned, his voice booming over the chaos, filled with urgency and determination. Now! Give them everything you got! Don't let them get out! We need to finish this now! The preppers could sense it too. Victory was within their grasp. They focused all their energy, their shots more precise. They fired at the enemy who was now trapped with nowhere to run, their backs against the wall. Jimmy's voice echoed through the barn again. Give them everything you got! The gunfire was relentless, the flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the night as the preppers unleashed everything they had. The enemy was pinned down, unable to move, their numbers dwindling with each passing second. Jimmy turned to one of the preppers beside him, an older man named Kyle. Kyle, the Molotov cocktails, now! Kyle nodded. He grabbed 2 of the makeshift bombs. He moved to the window, his hands steady as he lit the rags and threw them into the darkness. The Molotovs arced through the air, their flames trailing behind them before they burst on impact, the fiery explosion lighting up the enemy's position. When they run, take them out, Jimmy shouted. Mark was up on the 2nd floor, his eyes locked through the sights on his rifle. He scanned the area, his finger tight on the trigger. Then he saw him. Jonas. Mark's heart filled with rage, his vision narrowing as he focused on the man who had brought so much pain to their home. Aiming carefully before squeezing the trigger, the shot rang out. But it missed, the bullet flying just past Jonas. Come on, you piece of shit, Mark muttered, his voice filled with frustration. He aimed again, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired, but Jonas was already on the move, taking 4 of his men with him as he ran towards the forest. Jimmy, Jonas is moving back to the forest, Mark shouted, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. Jimmy looked up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Jonas and his men retreating. We can't let them get away, Jimmy said, his voice filled with urgency. We need to end this now. He turned his eyes, locking onto Dozer, who was crouched nearby. Dozer, let's go. We need to get Jonas. Jimmy, Dozer, and 3 other preppers moved quickly, making their way to the ground. Jimmy turned, seeing Mark following close behind. He stopped, his eyes focused as he looked at Mark. Let us handle this, Jimmy said. You have a family to think about. Mark shook his head. I'm not letting you go alone, he said, his voice steady. You're my family too. Jimmy hesitated for a split second, then nodded. Stay in the back, he said. He turned to the small group of preppers. We need to finish this tonight, Jimmy said. We need Jonas. If we don't get him now, he's going to keep coming back, understood? A resounding yes, sir, rang out from the group. Jimmy nodded. Let's roll out. The group slipped away from the barn, their footsteps quiet as they headed toward the woods. The night was pitch black, lit only by the distant glow of flames still burning. Dozer led the way, his rifle at the ready, scanning the area with practiced precision. Suddenly, he dropped to one knee, peering through his sights, motioning for the others to halt. There are 4 of them left, Dozer said. We can hunt them down, but we need to move now. Jimmy nodded, his eyes locked on the forest ahead. Let's move, he said. Dozer led the group into the darkness, their figures disappearing into the shadows as they moved toward the forest. The only sound is the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. They knew what they had to do. They had to end this. Tonight. Chapter 75. No Loose Ends. The group entered the dark forest with Dozer at the front, his gaze fixed on the shadows ahead. The trees loomed thick around them, their long shadows stretching under the faint moonlight. They moved quietly, the faint crunch of their footsteps the only sound as they ventured deeper into the woods. Keep your eyes peeled, Dozer whispered. They stopped for a moment, taking in their surroundings, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. Mark looked over at Jimmy. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Jimmy nodded, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "Yes, he'll keep coming back if we don't finish this. You can go back to your family, Mark. We can handle this." Mark shook his head. "I'm not letting you do this by yourself. We're in this together." Dozer held up a hand. "I have movement up ahead," he whispered. They all crouched, peering out from behind the foliage, trying to get a clear view. Jimmy fixed his eyes on the figures in the distance. "Give us the order," he said, his voice firm. "We move in quick and take them out." Dozer squinted, his eyes scanning the area. "I think there are 3 of them," he said. "I don't see Jonas." Jimmy nodded, his jaw clenched. "Keep one of them alive. We need to track that son of a bitch down." Dozer exhaled slowly. "Okay, ready," he whispered. They waited, hearts pounding, fingers gripping the triggers of their rifles. "Go now!" Dozer shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. They charged into the darkness, their feet pounding against the forest floor, their rifles raised. They were ready to finish the job once and for all. They moved into position, the enemy about 50 yards ahead. Jimmy's voice cut through the night. "Keep one of them alive! I want to fucking find out where Jonas is!" They continued to move through the forest, their senses on high alert. Suddenly, shots rang out, the sounds echoing through the trees. "Covering fire!" Dozer shouted, his voice filled with panic. The night erupted in gunfire, the flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the darkness. Jimmy pushed forward, his face filled with rage. He opened fire, dropping an enemy soldier. More shots rang out, the remaining soldiers falling back, taking cover behind the trees. "We can finish this!" Dozer shouted. "Keep moving! Don't let them get away!" They pushed deeper into the forest, the rage of the loss of life at the homestead powering them forward. They were determined to finish the job, to end this once and for all. Mark's body ached, but the adrenaline coursing through him kept him moving. He shifted to the right, taking cover beside Dozer. As he settled, movement caught his eye. He froze, his gaze locking on a figure standing in the moonlight. Without hesitation, Mark raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the night, and the figure crumpled to the ground. "One down over here!" Mark shouted. Another burst of gunfire rang out, and Dozer's voice echoed through the darkness. "Got one, I think," Dozer shouted. "Keep the pressure on." The firefight began to die down, the sounds of gunfire growing less frequent. It was no longer a battle. It was a hunt. They were looking for the last one, Jonas. "Keep looking," Jimmy shouted. "He's around here somewhere. Find him!" Mark moved cautiously through the woods, his rifle at the ready. He stayed close behind Dozer, the 2 of them moving in tandem, their senses on high alert. The silence of the forest pressing in on them. They knew there were 2, maybe 3 more left along with Jonas. A burst of shots rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet of the forest. An explosion followed, the bright flash of light blinding them for a moment. "Dozer!" Mark shouted. Dozer screamed in pain, his voice filled with agony. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" he shouted, his body dropping to the ground. Mark hit the forest floor, his eyes wide with fear as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the gunfire. The tree line erupted with gunfire, the flashes of light illuminating the darkness, the sound echoing through the forest. Chapter 76. Fallen Blood. Mark came to his senses, the ringing in his ears slowly fading as he blinked, trying to focus. He looked around, the dark forest still and silent for a moment. He crawled over to where Dozer lay, his heart pounding in his chest. "You good?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse, his breath coming in short gasps. Dozer looked down at his side, his face pale, his hand pressed against the wound. Blood was seeping through his fingers, staining his clothes. "I think so," Dozer said, his voice shaky. He lifted his hand slightly, wincing in pain. I think it grazed me. It just grazed me. Mark could hear the nervousness in Dozer's voice. It was unsettling. Dozer was usually the calm one, the one who kept everyone steady. Seeing him like this, vulnerable, made Mark's stomach twist. He needed to keep them both focused. Mark raised his rifle, aiming into the trees, and fired off a few shots. The enemy fire had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet. He turned back to Dozer. Hold on, Mark said. We'll get you back to camp. Dozer shook his head, his face filled with determination. No, keep going. I can stay here, finish the job. Jimmy came running over, his eyes wide with concern. Dozer, you all right? He asked, his voice filled with urgency. Dozer nodded, trying to sit up. I'm fine, keep going. No way in hell, Jimmy said, his voice firm. I'm taking you back. He turned to Mark. Stay with him. I'm going to go get the others. We rally here and get him back. Mark nodded, raising his rifle and firing off some covering shots into the darkness. Jimmy turned and ran towards the other side of the forest, where the rest of the preppers were. Mark watched him go. He had to trust Jimmy to get back safely. But as Jimmy moved through the forest, his focus entirely on saving Dozer, he didn't see an enemy in the darkness. He didn't see the figure hidden behind a tree. His eyes locked on Jimmy. He didn't see him step out, his rifle raised. He didn't see him pull the trigger. He didn't see Jonas. The shots rang out, the sound echoing through the forest. Jimmy cried out, his body dropping to the ground, his voice filled with pain. Mark's heart dropped, his eyes widening in horror. He turned, his legs moving before he could even think. He sprinted towards Jimmy. There, just ahead, he saw Jonas stepping out from behind a tree, his rifle aimed at Jimmy. Jonas moved slowly, his eyes locked on Jimmy, his finger on the trigger ready to deliver the final shot. No! Jimmy shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Jonas looked up, a cold smile spreading across his face. You should have fucking listened, Jonas said, his voice dripping with malice. He was about to pull the trigger when a bullet whizzed by his face, so close that he could feel the air move. He turned, his eyes wide, looking for the source of the shot. There, rushing toward him, was Mark, his face twisted with rage. Die, you son of a bitch! Mark shouted, his hand steady as he raised his rifle. He aimed his finger tightening on the trigger and fired. The shot rang out, the sound echoing through the forest. The bullet hit Jonas square in the head. A perfect shot. His body collapsed to the ground, lifeless, like a bag of stones. The gunfire in the woods stopped, the silence almost soothing. The threat was gone. All the enemy soldiers had been eliminated. Mark stood there, his rifle still raised, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body was filled with adrenaline. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then all at once, reality came rushing back. The pain, the cries, the sounds of Jimmy's voice calling out in agony. Mark turned, his eyes locking on Jimmy, who was lying on the ground, his hands clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Jimmy! Mark shouted, his voice filled with panic. He dropped to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as he tried to assess the wound. Hold on, Jimmy, just hold on. Jimmy looked up at Mark, a faint smile on his lips. Nice shot, he said, his voice weak. I owe you one. Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with concern. Somebody had to drop that fucker, he said, his voice tight with emotion. Jimmy let out a shaky breath, his face pale. I'll be fine, he said, trying to sound reassuring. It's just a flesh wound. Mark frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the wound. He moved Jimmy's shirt aside, his heart sinking at what he saw. It wasn't just a flesh wound. Blood was oozing out, soaking through Jimmy's clothes, and Mark could see the color draining from his face. Mark's heart began to pound, panic rising in his chest. "Help!" he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "I need help over here! I need help!" Jimmy's breathing was growing more labored, his face growing even paler. He reached out, grabbing Mark's arm, his grip weak. "I'm so happy you came here," Jimmy said, "that I could see you again." "No," Mark said, his voice cracking. "Don't you fucking start talking like that." Jimmy winced, a pained expression crossing his face. He took a shallow breath, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "Your wife and your daughter, they're beautiful," he said, his voice trembling. "You did such a good job." Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Help!" he shouted again, his voice filled with pure panic. "I need help now! He's bleeding out!" Jimmy's grip on Mark's arm tightened for a moment, the last bit of strength he had left. "Mark," he said, "I want you to take over. You're a good leader. You can keep them safe." "I'm not losing you," Mark said, his voice filled with emotion. "You're not going to die, you hear me?" But Jimmy's eyes were beginning to close, his breaths coming in short gasps. He was going in and out of consciousness, his grip on Mark's arm growing weaker. The others came running over, their faces filled with concern. Mark looked up at them, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get him back to camp," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "He's losing blood." The group moved fast, lifting Jimmy carefully. Mark stayed by Jimmy's side, his hand still pressed against the wound. "Hurry," Mark said, his voice cracking. "Please, hurry, please." They moved through the forest, their footsteps quick but careful, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Mark stayed beside Jimmy the entire time, his heart heavy, his eyes filled with tears. He couldn't lose him, not now, not after everything they had been through. The group moved swiftly, their breaths coming in short gasps, the weight of Jimmy's body heavy on their shoulders. They were determined to get him back to camp, to save him, to keep him alive. And as they moved, Mark stayed by his side, his eyes locked on Jimmy. But Jimmy's breathing grew shallower, his eyes fluttering closed. His body felt heavier, his head lolling to the side. Mark's heart sank, his hope fading. Jimmy's hand slipped from Mark's arm, his eyes closing, his chest falling still. Mark's entire world narrowed to the sight of his brother slipping away. "No, Jimmy, no!" Mark screamed, his voice breaking. He shook Jimmy, but there was no response. The others exchanged glances, their faces filled with sorrow. One of them put a hand on Mark's shoulder, but he shrugged it off, tears streaming down his face. "He can't be gone," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "He can't." But there was no denying it. Jimmy was still, his face pale, his body limp. For a long moment, the forest around them fell silent. Chapter 77. A new chapter. 3 months later. Mark's hammer pounded nails into the new cabin frame, the rhythmic thud echoing through the fall air. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he paused for a second, wiping his brow as he surveyed the homestead. The fall air was crisp, and everything seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sun. There was a certain satisfaction in the air. He looked around and admired the progress they had made over the last 3 months. After the raid, there had been no more threats. The energy that had once been dedicated to protecting the homestead could now be spent on expanding it. The missing preppers had returned, bringing with them 27 others they had found in the surrounding areas. It was a lot of people, and Mark knew supplies would be iffy. There were doubts about whether they could all survive, but Mark had no hesitation in taking them in. Without those extra hands, they wouldn't have survived the raid, and he trusted that they would find a way to make it work. Initially, there had been nervousness about the new additions. They'd all wondered if these new people would be willing to pull their weight, or if they would end up being another mouth to feed. But everyone had earned their keep, and the nervousness faded. The fires from the raid had burned down 2 cabins and destroyed the front wall, but with everyone working together, they had quickly repaired the damage. Since then, they had built 8 new cabins and were planning to build 8 more before winter arrived. Mark climbed down from the cabin, setting his hammer aside, as he made his way towards his own family cabin. He opened the doors and called out, "Come on, dinner's ready. Let's join the others." He saw Hope and Sarah sitting together, and they both looked up and smiled at him. They had a quick conversation about their day. Hope told him about helping with the garden, while Sarah spoke about fixing up some of the clothes they had gathered. "Did you see how big the tomatoes are getting, Dad?" Hope asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Mark chuckled. "I did. You're doing a great job out there. We'll have enough tomatoes to last us through the winter at this rate." Sarah smiled, shaking her head. "I swear that girl has a green thumb. She's been out there every morning making sure everything is just right." "Somebody's got to make sure we have good food," Hope said, grinning. Mark nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "And you're doing just that. All right, let's get moving before the food gets cold." They all headed out of the cabin together, making their way towards the main dinner hall. Mark watched as Hope and Sarah ran ahead, their laughter filling the air. It was a reminder of everything they had sacrificed to create this place, and it was worth every bit of it. As Mark made his way to the dinner hall, he felt a hand grab his shoulder. He turned to see Dozer standing there, a smirk on his face. "How's the cabin coming along, President?" Dozer asked with a teasing grin. Mark rolled his eyes. "Should be good. Ready to move on to the next one." Dozer nodded. "All right, and you're good for tonight's meeting, right? Everyone's excited to see your new build-out plans." Mark and Dozer continued walking for a bit, chatting as they went. "You know, I gotta hand it to you," Dozer said, his tone softening. "You stepped up when we needed it the most. A lot of folks look up to you now." Mark gave a small smile, shaking his head. "I just did what had to be done. We all did. It's not about any one of us. It's about everyone working together." Dozer nodded. "Yeah, but still, it's good to have someone leading the charge, and you've been a damn good leader." Mark eventually stopped, looking back towards the cabins. "You go on ahead. I need to do something real quick." Dozer nodded and walked on, while Mark turned and headed towards Jimmy's cabin. He opened the door, stepping inside and looking around. His eyes settled on a few old photographs on the mantel. Pictures of the 2 of them when they were younger, before all this had happened. "You come here for advice?" a voice said from behind him. Mark turned and a smile spread across his face. There standing in the doorway was Jimmy, leaning on 2 crutches, his face pale but alive. "Nah, I can handle a little meeting," Mark said, shaking his head. Jimmy gave him a knowing smile. "Well, you better not get too used to it. Once I get back on my feet, I'm taking over again." Mark walked over, taking one of Jimmy's arms and helping him towards the door. "You can have it," Mark said with a chuckle. "I don't want all this responsibility anyway." Jimmy laughed, the sound filling the cabin as they made their way outside. Mark's voice softened as he began to narrate to himself. "Everything happens for a reason, and even though we lost a man at the medical supply mission, those supplies were crucial in keeping Jimmy alive. He'll be back on his feet in no time." The 2 men walked towards the dinner hall, and as they approached, they could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows. They stepped inside, and Mark felt a warmth fill his chest as he looked around at the scene. The hall was bustling with activity, people gathered around tables, sharing stories and enjoying the meal. They took their seats, Mark helping Jimmy settle into his chair before grabbing a plate of food for himself. The homestead had grown to over 40 preppers now, and it was fully operational. Despite the losses, despite the fear, they had managed to make it through. Mark glanced over at Sarah and Hope, watching as they chatted with some of the other families. They looked happy, their faces relaxed. Life was simpler now without power, without the constant hum of technology. It was easier to enjoy the moment, to appreciate the small things that made life worth living. Sarah caught Mark's eye and smiled, giving him a small wave. Mark waved back, feeling his heart swell with warmth. Hope was laughing, her voice carrying across the room. It was moments like this that made everything they had been through worth it. Dozer stood up from the other side of the room, raising his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying over the conversation. The room quieted, everyone turning to look at him. "To everyone here," Dozer continued, glancing around the room. "We've been through hell and back, but we made it. We're still standing, and we're stronger than ever. To the homestead, to family, and to the future." A chorus of "to the future" echoed through the hall as everyone raised their glasses. Mark lifted his own glass, his eyes meeting Jimmy's. Jimmy gave him a nod, his eyes filled with pride. There was something special about it, working hard all day, sitting down to a nice home-cooked meal with friends and family, and listening to stories around a campfire before bed. It wasn't the life they had once known, but it was a good life. As the meal went on, Mark found himself looking around the hall, his eyes settling on the faces of the people he had come to know and care for. They had built something special here, a community, a family. They were stronger together, and he knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it head on. After dinner, the group gathered around a large campfire outside. The sky was clear, stars twinkling above them as the flames flickered and danced. Someone began telling a story, a light-hearted tale of the past, and laughter spread through the group. Hope sat next to Mark, resting her head on his shoulder. "I like it here, Dad," she said softly. Mark smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I like it here too, sweetheart. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and we're going to make it even better." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Do you think it'll ever go back to how it was before?" Mark was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I don't know. Maybe one day. But even if it doesn't, we're going to be okay. We have everything we need right here." Hope nodded, a content smile on her face. "Yeah, we do." They knew the homestead was safe for now, but they also knew that they might be tested again. And if that day came, they would be ready. They were prepared. They had survived the raid, and they had come out stronger on the other side. But for now, it was just one day at a time. One meal, one laugh, one story at a time. And that was enough. The end.